Welcome to Catholic in America. Today we're talking about, did the historical figure of Jesus exist? Is it rational to believe that he actually existed?
So we'll look at this question, the objections to the historical Jesus, people pitting together, pitting the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith against each other, modern atheistic so-called biblical scholars, and what the Catholic response to this is as well.
So if you like to listen to more absurdities, tune in.
Welcome back to Catholic in America. Today I'm joined by my co-hosts, Father Tom Dillon and Father Michael Nixon. I'm Father Doug Martin, and today we're talking about, did Jesus actually exist? Is there a historical figure named Jesus? Is it rational to actually believe that? And
if so, does it matter? Because if it's just a guy, then,
sure.
But if he's actually Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Son of God, Savior of the world, all those sorts of things. So yeah. I'm excited to dive into this. Father Tom is not excited about this at all.
Not at all.
I'm about as excited as to talk about flat earthing.
That's our next show.
Yeah. So, flat earthers.
We're telling a lot of complimentary things to get him excited about this. So here we are.
Well, if I can just kind of start us off on this, because I think this is something that comes up a lot. It comes up a lot with people where the kind of it's almost kind of like a popular historical reading of Christianity, that Jesus, maybe there was this guy, possibly this sort of wandering itinerant preacher, but then he got blown into, mythologizing him, making him this sort of person who never claimed to be God during his life. And then they kind of built the church on that just to control people. So I think there's almost like you have sort of these sweeping narratives of history that don't have to prove themselves in order to be believed. But kind of like you'd be like, the Dark Ages. You just sort of say that. The Dark Ages, you can say whatever you want about the Dark Ages, even though they built Notre Dame Cathedral during the Dark Ages. Like, there was this time, they didn't even know what was going on. They didn't know which way was up. But the same thing I feel about with Jesus, that a lot of people inherit this kind of very unscientific historical reading about the life of Jesus and just kind of regurgitate it. It's like he didn't even exist, or if he did exist, it didn't really matter. It kind of just got blown out of proportion later on. I don't know. Have you guys seen this? You guys experienced this?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Absolutely. Hear it quiet. You don't hear it. I don't hear it as sophisticated as that, because mainly I hear it from middle school and high school kids, and so for them it's just blowing it off so they can go kind of live the way they want to live, or not. They don't have to take religion as seriously, or they don't have to take their parents as seriously because it's coming from their parents. The religion kind of stuff is, and then for me I also see it online a little bit as well. But because we live here in the South, I don't get that from adults that much. Every now and again, but not as much. But yeah, I mainly deal with it with the school age kids that I deal with.
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
You have a high school, so it's got to come up. I'm sure you don't let it slide in your religion classes.
Your kids say you're easy.
I mean, they say they're easy. That's not what I've heard. I mean, I've heard a little bit of kids who more often than not are uninformed, or that they're just like, we don't even know if he exists. I'm just like, what's your sources? Like, what's your sources and why are you saying that? And then usually 95% of the time that I encounter a person who's saying, we don't even know if Jesus exists. I was like, have you read any first, second century sources? Like, what's your sources? Like, prove it through. And that's where all of a sudden they get, and then they start wishy-washy. But you will, like I said, the more stronger arguments which I've heard is obviously coming from the atheist demytholizers of demythization.
Mythicist, dude. Mythicist, whatever.
There was always just a big myth. Maybe there was some type of historical figure, but usually what I've heard is in two different kind of schools. One is that the apostles, so Jesus' friends, the people around him, blew him into this figure that he was not. Right? Because their proof for that is that we don't actually have any of Jesus' actual writings. All that we have is the writings of his friends and apostles, because he didn't do anything.
Which is why I don't believe in the existence of Caesar.
Correct. Right. But the idea, the logical flow is that therefore, because we don't have Jesus' actual writings, we only have his apostles. Therefore, Jesus never said any of these things, which is complete bogus logic. Like, no, you can't say that therefore Jesus didn't. It is the unknown. That's where, obviously, for faith, like, we don't have the gospel according to Jesus. We have the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So, like, when you look at that, but the other one, which I've heard more frequently, and that's where I've read a couple of different books recently. One was called Constantine's Sword. Interesting book. Wouldn't suggest it.
Not good history, but it is interesting.
It's interesting. It was written by an ex-priest. Ex-priest. It's given to me, and then I read another one, which was I don't even remember. I deleted it from my memory banks after reading it, but it was by an Italian publisher. It was basically talking about the same thing. Is that actually Constantine's Sword? The author was trying to make an argument that the church, as we know it today, was more created by the Roman Empire, right? And that it was basically this combination of the Roman Empire, of Constantine, and that this Christ, as we understand him today, was more of like the evolution of how it happened. It happened more during the Roman period. So there's these two branches that I've heard is that it's the Roman period. It was when Constantine legalized everything, or it was the apostles. But regardless, we don't even know who the actual historical figure of Jesus is. That's the idea behind it. So, right. But most of the strict atheists that I've read or encountered, they don't usually challenge the actual historical figure of Jesus, because to try to prove that, you can't prove that one way or another through the empirical method. It's just, and almost no serious historical scholar is going to say that Jesus did not exist. There was certainly a man who.
Right. Yeah, Jesus from Nazareth. You have that, from Josephus as well as so many other people, and obviously, you have the biblical accounts of that, which are, as far as ancient texts, the most well attested, and across many different languages and many different cultures. Using that textual criticism sort of thing. There's no ancient documents more well attested than the New Testament, and across the entire Roman Empire, across tons of different languages, Greek. Into Africa, into Latin, of course. So it's historically there's a very, very strong case for this, and I think that's always something that's important to say that we because why is it important for us too? Because as Catholic Christians, and this goes back before the legalization of Christianity under Constantine, that Christianity was always rooted in historical events, which
separate Christianity from the rest of the Greek and Greco-Roman world.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually which comes to us, and I think it's interesting to me whenever this sort of stuff gets sort of spun out. I mean, especially when they're like, oh, this, we'll talk about the mythologizing stuff as far as Jesus is Horus or Jesus is Mithras or Jesus is was the one you say Ra. He's Ra. He's these sort of things. What it shows Dionysus, and a lot of the atheistic or anti-mythologizing biblical commentaries that get quoted whenever this stuff comes up. Every Easter, it's always like, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? And Bart Ehrman's is always the one they're talking to, or John Dominic Crossan from the Jesus Seminar, who are both people who do not believe in the divinity of Jesus, do not believe in the historicity of the Gospels, do not believe in miracles, don't believe in any of that sort of stuff, and yet this is their life's work. So it's interesting to me that they study this stuff all the time, make a good living off of it, right? Good living off of denying this, but it's always a separation of Jesus from Judaism. Because once you separate Jesus from his Jewish context, in a sense, you can make him whatever you want him to be. Right. But Judaism is always rooted in history. This Jewish context is even like, for the Exodus and their understanding of what God has done, it's always rooted and connected to their history. And so when you kind of just divorce Jesus from that, it just becomes this sort of like this spiritual guru person, and he might as well be called, something else. He might as well be Krishna, or he might as well be, some other kind of Eastern religious figure.
Which you're familiar with.
I'm familiar with Krishna.
You're familiar with Krishna.
Family we used to be Hare Krishnas. I used to worship Krishna. We've seen the error of our ways, and we worship Jesus now. But anyway, so I think that's another kind of undercurrent here, is people don't understand the Jewish roots of Christianity, of the New Testament, of Jesus' life and ministry, of what he did when he instituted the Eucharist, what he did when he instituted the priesthood, what he did when he instituted the church. All that is connected to and flows from, which is why I think the Catholic context is so important, because we always know and understand that you have to read the New Testament in light of the Old Testament in light of the New. When you don't have that, it becomes much easier to just kind of sort of demythologize and dismiss Jesus as just some Near East invention in the 4th century.
And I think that's been the case over the last 50 or 60 years to really root ourselves more in. I mean, I one of the things that actually drew me to the Catholic Church was this idea that Jesus was Jew. That Jesus was Jewish. And what that actually means when you read the scriptures, when you actually read St. Paul and realize, no, he was a very faithful Jew who became a Christian, what that actually means. And it plays into what we're talking about the historicity of things. But you did mention something, the Jesus Seminar. There is this group of Christian scholars who made this, made the question of the historical Jesus. And so there was one point in the late 80s, early 90s, I don't even know if this group is still going on. Maybe this is my lack of reading it, but still going on. But what they would do is they would get together and they would look at particular passages from the gospel, and then they would vote on whether this was real or not and what part of it was real or not.
It's amazing.
Did you guys know about this?
I know about it. John Dominic Crossan and the Jesus Seminar. You said they're Christian scholars, and I'm kind of like,
well, maybe
they're scholars about Christian topics. Let me put it that way. I don't know. Maybe they would consider themselves believers within that, which I find fascinating. But I think anyone who's gone to, I went to Florida State University, go Noles, for undergrad, and I took the New Testament course there. Anyone's taken a religious studies Christianity course, you've basically been immersed in more or less a Jesus Seminar version of Christianity that says, like, most of the New Testament was not written by the actual eyewitnesses. Right. Most of the New Testament was made up in the years following, that it was put together under Constantine, that it was like all these sort of things are, any sort of miraculous aspects of it are
oftentimes presented as fact,
yes,
as opposed to conjecture.
Right.
Yeah. I went to a Methodist college, and I watched people come there because it was a Methodist Christian school and lose their faith after Old Testament, New Testament survey because of this very thing.
Yeah.
Where the professors unwittingly, I mean, there was one of the professors we had who was a wonderful Christian man that was teaching this stuff because that's what he'd been taught. And so I was watching my friends become not only not Methodist, but not Christian at all, just kind of losing their faith over things like this. It's presented as fact. We're enlightened, and this is the way things are.
Jesus never said
because
any of this stuff.
Because everyone in the old times was so stupid because they didn't understand, and the people didn't understand their stories as they were told, and the lens by which they were told. But they were foolish. They were the ancients. The ancients didn't understand things like myth and history.
So since the tact really of trying to prove that Jesus wasn't a historical figure, I mean, I think we can probably say, at least in academia, that's no longer really a serious topic. I mean, you may find
from Jewish historians, from Roman historians of the time, and from obviously the gospel.
It's pretty well established.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think it's also for those who are listening, like Josephus, who was Jewish, right? Who was not Christian, like his whole writing of it, and that's like, again, you're looking at secondary sources, or you're looking at primary sources who are attesting to the historicity of the man, who have no vested interest. Actually, their vested interest is to disprove it. The same thing is, like, I'm trying to remember there's 2 Roman accounts going to the 1st century who talk about it as well. Is not Plot
Tacitus? No.
Yeah, it might be Tacitus, but there's another one that begins with a P. I'm just blanking right now. But anyways, there's multiple different Roman sources which talked about Christus and the followers of Christus who are causing so many problems.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So, like, you have early primary source documentation that goes back to secular sources that are anti-Christian, which attest to that. So that's the thing.
Yeah, Josephus was Jewish, but very pro-Roman because he wanted to endear himself to Rome. So he had
every reason to put it down.
Yeah.
Every reason.
Correct.
To put it
so
down.
that's what I'm saying. Like, when you have, like, in terms of our as ability as human beings to prove anything historically. Yes. Like, I can say I don't have a George Washington. Like, I can try to say that George Washington because I can't see and touch him.
Right.
And therefore, like, I can say that you can come up with all types of conspiracy theories in terms of,
you said Caesar. I mean,
historical narrative. Like, you can say that they didn't exist, but the facts line up. The fact that there was a historical person whose name was Jesus. Now, was he the Son of God? Right. That's obviously
that's the claim. That's we get to dive into that.
So before we get to that, though, we're going to go to break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about another where this has all kind of gone in scholarship. So we'll be right back.
Whatever the original intent for social media was, it probably wasn't this.
Well, I'm sure you've seen this viral video.
And to the beat.
Gaming weekday
This egg is the most liked Instagram picture.
Yikes. See what I mean? However, at St. Dominic Media, we found a much better way to do social.
It is a joy, a pleasure to want to spend time with the Lord and with one another.
If you delight in the Lord, He would give you the desires of your heart. And so I prayed Him to send me to the right church. And so He led me to the one that He established, which is the Catholic Church.
So I'm sitting in my quiet space, my time with God, praying for my grandchildren.
Understand that the devil isn't only the enemy of our souls, he's the enemy of our human nature. And so what God has joined, He wants to rupture.
Judeo-Christian values.
You corrected it. Judeo-Christian values. Your brain corrected it. Oh, that's fantastic.
Every year, we produce hundreds of dynamic, faithful Catholic videos that reach millions of people, both online and on television. At St. Dominic Media, we're doing the heavy lifting of creating good, quality Catholic content, and we'd love for you to partner with us, either by visiting stdominicmedia.com and following the share link, or by using the offertory envelopes offered by your parish from OSV. Help us sow seeds far and wide as we use new media's potential for good. Together, let us invest in and grow the kingdom.
So, hey guys, as we're having this conversation, if you could like, share, and subscribe, it helps us out. We'd love to see your comments as well. Leave some comments. Leave something nice, if you want. I mean, man.
We've heard we get mean comments.
Apparently, we get a lot of mean comments, which is fine. If you want to leave something mean, we can take. We got high self-esteem. But leave comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this conversation, on things that you've heard about the historicity of Jesus. And we'll just, the more you like, share, and subscribe, the more we can have these kind of conversations and moving forward.
Yeah, hit us with something that maybe we didn't cover. Maybe we'll come back in and do a little 1 minute or 2 minute thing. I don't even know what they're called on TikTok anymore. It's something, I don't know. But anyway, so as we come back from
look, kids, we're hip. Is what we're trying to say.
We're hip. We know what we're talking about. So as we come back, we were just talking about how the historicity of Jesus is well established.
And
Pliny.
There it is.
Pliny, Pliny, however you pronounce his name, Pliny.
Yes.
Early Roman historian. I had to look that up on Google because I couldn't remember it.
So as we move from that, the real threat that's really happened in the last probably 20 years, 25 years maybe, but that's really become more popular in the last 15 or so is this idea that Jesus was a myth. Mm-hmm. And so talk about that.
Yeah, that's a big one. So there's that classic formulation, maybe some people have heard it from C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist and became a Christian apologist, great writer. And in Mere Christianity, he talks about Jesus, the kind of that threefold thing that Jesus could be either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. He's that you can't say about Jesus that he's just like some nice guy who did things, because a nice guy wouldn't claim to be who he was, which he claimed to be the Lord. So he either is the Lord or he's a liar, which you need to be rejected because he's a liar, charlatan, or he's a lunatic, a crazy person, and then you need to reject what he says then too. So the fourth thing is like, well, maybe he's not the Lord, maybe he's not a liar, maybe he's not a lunatic, maybe he's just a myth. Yeah. So this mythic reality, this thing has kind of been built up around him. Jesus was maybe a nice guy, a good guy who did things, helped people out, tell people to share. Told people to not judge one another, to recycle. He said things that like are palatable for us in a 21st century context. He told people not to be bigots. Things that were
love your enemies. All that. Yeah.
And but then this whole thing about him being God or him being God in the flesh or him found in a church, all that was just made up afterwards as kind of this mythical accrual on Jesus, and then using other mythic kind of sources of Mithras and Ra and Horus. That kind of uses thing of this God that dies and is born again, has 12 followers, all this sort of stuff. So I think that's kind of the new thing, the challenge to that historical, I think, very clean argument that C.S. Lewis had that we're now facing today is right. He's a myth. or at least all the stuff that people believe about.
There's mythic quality. Because I think that the sources I've read on it is that not that he himself is a myth, that he didn't exist, but that the legend surrounding him is exactly that. It's a legend. It's a myth. It was exaggerated. The apostles exaggerated.
Muad'Dib.
Yeah,
is what he is of doom. Yes.
That's what most myths are. Myths are built around historical things that get kind of blown out of proportion. I mean, myth can be about someone who's died.
It depends on which myths you're talking about, because you're also talking even during the Greek period, most of the Greeks didn't actually believe that historical realities of
Hercules
or
Zeus.
Of Zeus, so like Zeus and Leto and all like these various different things, they didn't believe necessarily they believed that they were stories. They were stories which contained psychological truths, but they were not historical.
Right. If you'd ask them when and where did that happen?
Yeah, they're like where is Zeus? Where is Zeus on Mount Olympus? And they're most of the Greeks at the time didn't believe that Zeus was literally on Mount Olympus. It was more of an intellectual thing. The plebes, the plebeians, the people, the commoners believed that Zeus was there, but a lot of the intellectuals of that time didn't believe in the literal historicity of the gods. They believed that maybe as an intellectual idea, the gods existed, but they didn't believe in the literal historicity of the gods. And the same can be said with almost all the myths of the ancient world. They didn't believe in most of the highly educated people didn't believe that they were actually historical figures.
Right.
Okay, so that's a
little different with this.
Because Christianity from the beginning has always said Jesus Christ crucified under Pontius Pilate. Right. That he came, lived, and died, and that he did the miraculous before. It's not just after his death, all of a sudden this guy's something special. Right. He was doing these miraculous things before his death. Every layer of Christianity attests to that. Things from the early, from the mid first century. Right around the time just after Jesus has died, saying who is Jesus? He's this guy that did these things, and these miraculous things. Whether it's the Gospels, letters of Paul, letters of John, all these things attest to this. And after he died, that he's been raised from the dead, and that our whole belief is rooted in that. So there's something, and I think this is the thing that the connections that are made. This is what I would always, because it's kind of tricky. They'll make these generalized weird connections, I think it's Horus is the one that, do you know Horus had 12 followers? And Horus gave a meal of his own body. And Horus, they'll do these things that are not actually true. Right. Horus didn't actually do those things. They'll take certain snippets from certain Egyptologists and from the late 19th century who were actually kind of anti-Christian and said this is exactly what's going on in Christianity, that this dying and rising again God is whether it's Horus or Ra. I might be getting those things confused. But anyway, there's certain aspects of this where I feel that it's just been sort of slapped onto this as a lazy history and lazy scholarship.
Convenient history.
Yeah, convenient. And this is where Christianity got from. They took this from Caesar being a god, being the son of God and dying and rising again and all these other things. So I think there's a certain kind of lazy, half-baked scholarship that goes a long way into feeding these sort of narratives.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are some of these mythicists who would say that Jesus didn't historically exist because he was this myth and got built up into this. But for the most part, they're saying that all this was kind of made up after him, that Jesus was just some itinerant preacher at best. I mean, what was the movie? I can't remember what the movie was. It was the 70s, 80s that it was at least a story that was written about Jesus was actually married to Mary Magdalene.
Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah, there it is, Last Temptation of Christ. Yep. So it's not as if we
and the Da Vinci Code and these things come up every.
So it's not as if we haven't had these things, but I do think that most people didn't take those things seriously until kind of this whole idea of this mythicist movement has come about, and so now there's people who are actually taking it a little bit more seriously. But I don't know how far down that's come, as far as how much it's coming to the general population of what they would say mythicist is, because it's a little highbrow even to kind of think about these things. But the influence is seeped down to us.
Absolutely. Again, you don't have to make the point. You don't have to be an expert in mythology to have inherited this sort of general sense or idea that all the things that we believe about Jesus, we just copied. Christianity just sort of copied that from other Eastern, Near Eastern, pagan religions, stories, founding myths and narratives and stuff. In a sense, there's kind of like this, you don't have to prove any of it because you just say it enough times and it's like, oh, okay, that's actually what happened. When we'd say quite the opposite, that Jesus is nothing like any of the ancient myths. What Jesus actually did, that we believe that he's actually God who actually came in the flesh, didn't appear to become in the flesh, that he actually lived and taught and died, that he actually fulfilled all the prophecies of Judaism that came before him, that he takes all that into himself, that he's actually raised from the dead in the body, which none of those Near Eastern myths would ever have anything to do with. The Greek ones definitely not, because they didn't, they thought the body was a prison and this evil thing, and that he actually invites us into a life with himself. So what actually is taught by Jesus and said and done and believed is completely contrary to every single myth that people try to attribute to him. Maybe there was a sense of what people dream, like those good dreams of the pagans that C.S. Lewis would also talk about, but fulfilled in a totally unexpected way.
Well, and I think there's also, in some of the stuff that I've read, even, and my background, like my undergrad, my minor, I was like a class away from a major in it, but it was anthropology. But like in a lot of the stuff with the myth, like this recent myth language, it's also written by persons who also generalize ancient cultures. So like it's like they speak on behalf of, this is what the Egyptians believed. This is what the Greeks believed. This is what the Mesopotamians believed. This is what they all believe, but it's their own conjecture and theory on what they believe, because what the Egyptians believe, anyone can read it in the little bit that we have in the hieroglyphics. Right, so it's these persons who have put together. I'm not saying that they're not intelligent. They're often, many of them are very intelligent, and a lot of what they're saying is probably accurate. But it's not like when you speak on behalf of ancient people, and you also say this is what they believed. You can't really say that. You can say this is what we think they believed. Right? There has to be always when looking at the history of not just our own church and of Christianity, but of all ancient peoples. And that's where I find, like in a lot of these people who write on this level of demythizing the Bible or demythizing Western civilization, all this talk of myth, there's over-speaking where they are interpreting the ancients without the lens of humility, right? And this is why, like, humility is not just a Christian virtue; it's a good human virtue of recognizing, like, we can't speak on behalf of all things, and therefore to say that we're going to disprove this based upon that this is what it meant at that time. Well, you can't really even say, like, that's the whole point of why, like, anthropology is like a whole school of conjecture for a lot. It's based on the hard science of the artifacts, but the theory that we're doing that is built up within that is exactly that. It's theory.
Speaking of myth.
As opposed to actually, but it's presented as fact. Like, that's the thing, is like, and that's why, like, good theory is like, it's theory, but it's presented as fact, and therefore we're going to disprove modern things based upon conjecture. And so that's the thing, is like, there's a lot of these talks of them. That's where I'm like, okay, well, that could be what the Egyptians believe, but it also, like, be careful about judging ancient societies, because that's all the thing is, like, you can find like 4 different Dionysian stories. You can find multiple different accounts of these different stories from ancient Egypt, and like, it's just, well, we have this codex over here, we have this one over here. Yeah, but that's because there was alternative theories at the time. Right? And now we have all these branching new theories of things, and now and so.
Well, no, I think it's a good point, that in a sense that, because it's showing that it's being written by people who grew up in a Christian, usually European background, then they're making judgments of ancient Near Eastern or Far Eastern or African cultures and societies, and saying, like, oh, because they're trying to actually prove the point about, well, obviously Jesus didn't exist because this stuff already existed before him. People were already saying these things, but they're reading it through that lens. Like I was thinking about this. I went years ago to the Holy Land. We were able to go to just off the Dead Sea, one of the sites of Qumran, one of the Essene communities there, and the Essene communities were studied by some of the first major scholars that gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything else, which is fascinating to get into the Dead Sea Scrolls and how much of that actually adds credence to the historical, Jesus and everything else. So there's a lot there we could talk about. John Bergsma has done a lot of great work in that. But when I was going through the little museum there, they had been studied by Dominican priests, Dominican biblical scholars were some of the original ones who had done a lot of study. So most of the way things were labeled, like this is the scriptorium, and this was the certain words that they would use was scriptorium, where they wrote stuff, where they wrote out scriptures and stuff. That was a Catholic Latinized version. So in a sense, the way that the scholar, and I'm just saying that to say the way the scholar approaches something, it's gonna be colored and it's like, oh, this makes sense in light of my own experience, or this makes sense in light of my own presuppositions. So that's one of the reasons it is very important. There are hard artifacts, but then we make judgments on that based on our own presuppositions, what we're trying to write a book about, particularly if someone's trying to disprove Christianity or prove that Jesus is just
or sell a book.
Or sell a book, absolutely.
That's going to have a wide audience. And
no, people don't do that, right?
Because unfortunately, if we don't take that into account, then we just have the fact that this is just this is pure science. You guys have religion. Now, it is important to say, from a religious perspective, when we're going to read something, we're also going to read it. We're going to have, I want this to be true because I believe in this and I believe in Jesus. So that all needs to be weighed in the actual scientific discussion as well. And I think good scholarship is not throwing out religious belief or thing. It's taking that into account as part of the discussion. I think that the scholarship that the Catholic Church has done and continues to do, based on Jesus, based on the historical Jesus, based on Jesus being who he says he was and who we believe him to be, is as strong and maybe I would say the best scholarship that's been in the history of the world. And so we've got to continue to press into that good, authentic, rigorous scholarship, because faith and reason are not opposed here. They actually help one another.
And let's face it, it's really had to be to have lasted the way that we have for 2,000 years. It really had to be. I mean, you think about the kind of scholarship that has gone into even Judaism as well. I mean, it has some similar things there about the historicity of things that happened in the Old Testament. I mean, for something to last that long, to have the kind of credence that it's supposed to have, you have to put a lot into it. It has to keep going. So I guess the question is if Jesus is a historical figure, and he did exist, and he existed in the way that he's portrayed in Scripture and throughout the history of the church, what does that mean to us today?
Yeah. And that, to me, it comes back to that C.S. Lewis thing. If he's not some mere myth, if he's not a crazy person, if he's not a liar, then he is who he says he is. He's the Lord. And if that's true, and if Jesus has been raised from the dead, then that changes everything. That changes that we're invited into a relationship with him, a relationship that includes a relationship with his church as well, and gives our lives meaning, and gives our lives new direction, gives our destiny, our eternal destiny changes because of that we've been saved by him. So to me, it gives hope. It gives hope to hopeless places, because unlike all the other myths, which basically the gods did their thing and then left people out to rot, This God, our understanding of God, is that he's entered into our brokenness and he draws us up with himself and into a better life. So to me, it's the gospel. If it's not true, then it's not important at all. It needs to be rejected. But if it's true, and I do believe it's true, it gives my whole life hope and meaning and joy too.
That's the most important thing.
Yeah. And I would just say, at least from my perspective, is Jesus a historical figure? I think that obviously scholarship. But I'm not going to base everything just based on scholarship, because I'm not an empiricist, right? So, aside from that question of was Jesus a historical figure, which I think that even if you were to look at that just through the lens of reason alone, that I don't think you can. I think it's almost absurd to say that Jesus was not a historical figure. But then the question becomes, who am I going to believe about what he's saying, who he was? And I'm going to believe the more primary sources, the people who are closer to him, than I'm going to believe someone who is separated 2,000 years later, right? So that's the whole point of why should I believe this person over here 2,000 years later who's telling me that this is not what Jesus said, right? I'm not going to, that to me makes no sense. I'm going to go back and, now, could the apostles have lied? Sure, they could have. Could they have spun this whole myth and it evolved throughout the years? But see, we have a way of accounting for that in called the development of faith, the development of tradition. Now, if you are of different other branches, you have a harder time of Christianity, if you're from Protestant, you have a harder time talking about the development of faith and tradition as it evolves and transforms over time without ever changing its core foundational principles. But like from the Catholic perspective, like that's not a problem for us. Even like the talking about the mythological or the mythic language of the Bible, certain things in the scriptures are absolutely mythic, right? But that doesn't mean that they're not true, but they're told through the lens of mythic language. But a mythic language is not a myth, right? And that's where you get into the fine language of what are we actually talking about. But that's the thing, is like in our Catholic faith, we can account for that, right? And it doesn't cause us some type of major problem intellectually or even in terms of faith. But for me, it gets down to why should I believe a person who's coming up with this newfangled theory 2,000 years separated from the actual historical man versus the persons who actually knew him?
And died for him.
And died. Like that's the whole thing. It's
They
like
wrote these scriptures in which they don't look very
correct,
good,
but
too.
now the counterpoint is like, well, they didn't actually write the Bible. Well, one, that's a theory, right? And you can hold that theory. I know many priests and I know other people who say that the apostles didn't actually write the actual ones. It was their communities, and that's a common theory, which is not a bad theory, right? And that's not even a problem for us. But I also don't have a problem that if Mark and Matthew and John wrote them. I don't like that's also a theory. Like we don't know 100% who actually penned them.
We don't have a photograph of them.
Correct. We don't have a photograph. We don't have empirical evidence of who it is. So like there's a certain point where I have to make a choice as a follower of Christ of do I trust his friends?
Yeah.
Right? Because we are the apostolic church. Like we are based upon the apostles. And so in that sense, like, but to me, what's more rational? Is it more rational for me to believe this person 2,000 years ago because he can trace and give me a new narrative of how I'm called to understand the last 2,000 years of history, or should I go back to the primary sources? For me, I make the simple, I'm going back to the primary sources. Right. And the closest persons to Jesus are going to be his friends, right? The people who didn't like Jesus at the time also can back up that those friends were there. They caused a lot of problems in their lives, whether it be Pliny or Tacitus or Josephus, right? So at the end of the day, like we're an apostolic church. Faith, tradition, and even our faith evolves over time. And so like it's not a problem.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you.
So yes, Jesus existed.
Yes.
Yeah, he did exist. We can mark that off and say that's true. So we hope that you believe that as well, and that it makes a difference in your life that you believe that. We believe as Catholic priests, as Catholic Church, it should make a difference.
Not only do we believe, we've given our lives to it.
Yeah, we've given our lives to it. And so we believe it, and we hope that you do as well.
Maybe we're either charlatans, crazy, or we actually follow the actual Son of God.
Yeah, we actually do it. So thank you for joining us today for this very important conversation. May God bless you.